Boa noite, as I say. Welcome to the series Brazil 200 Years of Independence, History, Language, and Culture. The topic this week are the links between Brazil and Barbados, or Barbados and Brazil, including the Sephardic Jews. It will be presented by Dr. Karl Watson. I introduce him as a multi-talented person here, and I will soon explain to you why. And it's hosted by me, Marco Schaumloeffel. I teach Portuguese and German at the Barbados Language Centre, Barbados Community College. So this series is brought to you by the Embassy of Brazil in Bridgetown and by the Barbados Language Centre, Barbados Community College. So welcome all. One can hardly, so it's really hard not to make a mistake if one wants to introduce Karl Watson. And why? Because Karl Watson is a man of so many traits. He does so many things. He is multi-talented, as I mentioned, that it is very easy to forget something of all the things he does. So he is active in several areas. So what I can tell you here is Karl Watson is a friend of mine. We taught together at the University of the West Indies for over a decade. He was actually the second examiner for my Brazilian culture exams. Okay. And what I can tell you is I know Karl Watson as my friend and lecturer at the university. He taught for over a decade in Jamaica as well. And I know Karl Watson as George Washington. So he plays George Washington in the George Washington house. And Karl Watson was my guide in town. So he knows all the relevant buildings in Bridgetown and their history. Karl Watson is a person interested in birds. So actually, this is something very unique that does not happen very often. Karl Watson was a historian, so he taught history at the University of the West Indies. And when he retired, he got a new contract from the university, but in biology. So he started to teach in biology. So that shows all the talents Karl Watson has. And Karl Watson knows a lot about Brazil. He was an assigned ambassador of Barbados to Brazil in the past. So that is why Karl Watson is this multi-talented person that I bet 99% of Barbadians know. And I also know Karl Watson from the press. So Karl Watson is every now and then in the press where journalists want to hear his opinion on different topics regarding the history of Barbados, heritage of Barbados. And I remember more recently, he was in the papers concerned about how the new or the old IRD building will be transformed into a housing project and how this housing project should be executed. So he is always very involved in different things. And actually, when we talk sometimes in German, sometimes in Spanish, sometimes in Portuguese, and in English. So also that shows how dynamic Karl Watson is. So I paid a visit to him yesterday morning, and we recorded his talk. And you will see, I will play this talk very soon, how many things he brings, interesting things about the links between Brazil and Barbados, okay? And at the end of this session, we will have some time for questions or comments, okay? I will leave you time for that. So I will now play the talk I recorded yesterday, and I will turn off my camera and microphone, and we can meet. And we can meet again at the end of this recording. Okay, so I hope you enjoy it. There we go.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Karl Watson. I'm a retired professor of history. I'm sure many of you all know me, but I thought it best to reintroduce myself, and it's my pleasure to be here with you this morning and discuss in some detail the links between the huge country Brazil and our tiny, beautiful island of Barbados. And I'm here at the invitation of Professor Marco Schaumloeffel, who was for many years my colleague at the University of the West Indies. Well, I want to start this morning's proceedings by showing you a map. Maps are very important, huh? And there's this saying in real estate, location, location, location. So here we have Let's see if I can get it in focus so you all can look at it. So there is a map showing Barbados and showing the centrality of Barbados. Barbados was and is the major hub of the Caribbean and is a transit point connecting the continents of Africa, South America, North America, and Europe. Everything at one point in time or another passes through Barbados. And you can see all the lines connecting our island, and you can see also a line pointing to South America, where steamship lines pass through all the various South American ports on the Atlantic side and all the major Brazilian ports and came to Barbados. So Barbados was a very important transit point. And to reinforce this, I'm going to show you something from this book, the Handbook of Barbados, published in 1912. And at the back, it has some ads. And again, these ads will serve to underscore the importance of the shipping links between Barbados and Brazil. So I have them marked, and here we are. You can see the Booth line of steamers, and that I'll read it for you. That says here, regular passenger and mail service direct to and from New York and North Brazil via Barbados. And it is important and germane to what I'll say in a little while that the traffic was not one-way traffic. Many Brazilians, particularly wealthy Brazilians on the way to Europe, would pass through Brazil and they'd get off a ship and perhaps spend a week or 2 weeks before boarding another vessel of the same steamship line and making their way to the UK, to ports of Southampton or London or Liverpool or wherever the vessel was going to dock. But on the other hand, as I pointed out, Barbadians, at a point in time when Barbadians were migrating, I think every one of you all is aware of the huge movement of Barbadians to Panama, for example, which later had a secondary movement of Barbadians from Panama after the canal had been built to Brazil. And I'll just bring this up again later on. But Barbadians also saw Brazil as a land of opportunity. You remember that famous Barbadian folk song, Millie Gone to Brazil. Well, that's a good indicator. Here's a man who murdered his wife, and he decided he was going to use her theoretical migration to Brazil as a cover-up for his crime, and he hoped to be able to get away with it. But it didn't happen. He paid the penalty for the murder. But yes, several hundred Barbadians in the early 20th century made their way to Brazil. We are aware of the connections between northern Brazil and the Brazilian states of Pernambuco, Bahia, and of course the links through the Amazon up to that huge Amazonian city that developed as a result of the rubber boom that took place in Brazil in the late 19th century. The city of Manaus was developed. And to create links into the hinterland of Brazil, railroads were necessary. And just as Barbadians played a major role in the building of the Panama Canal, so too did Barbadians play a major role in building the many railways that connected the coastal ports of Brazil with the interior developing towns in Brazil. One example is the inland Amazonian town of Porto, where Barbadians settled in large enough numbers that they actually replicated some of the typical Barbadian architecture that we know, primarily the chattel house form with its gable roof, its central entrance, match windows, incorporations of aspects of Georgian styles that were so popular in the 18th century and which, because they were so admired in Barbados, transferred through the centuries. Even today in Barbados, Georgian styles are still adapted in modern day housing in Barbados, as an aside. Georgian style of architecture incorporated on either sides of the building sort of rectangular blocks, one larger, one smaller, all along the side of the building. These were called coins. And if you look at modern day housing, there's a new house in development in St. Philip that was done a couple of years ago, and every single house up there has coins incorporated into it. So it's no wonder then that Barbadians in Brazil took the housing form that they were familiar with, the chattel house form, and replicated it in this town of Porto Velho and perhaps other areas in Brazil which haven't been identified or haven't been studied yet. But not only did Barbadians go to those northeastern states of Brazil, as I was saying, Brazil is a huge country, largest country in South America, one of the largest countries in the world. And opportunities were not limited to the area in the northeast of Brazil. In fact, to some degree, the more developed parts of Barbados are in the middle sectors of Brazil and in the southern states and towns of Brazil. So areas like Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro would have offered opportunities to Barbados. And then you have to excuse me, I was looking for it because I have a document I had wanted to read to you, but I can't. In the madhouse, that's my house. I simply cannot locate this document at this point in time. But it's an important document because it lists the Barbadians who went to the town of Espírito Santo. That's the correct name.
Yeah, Vitória Espírito Santo, yeah.
Yes, Espírito Santo is the state, but the town of Vitória. And who were these people? Because they give you a good idea of the impetus for migration from Barbados and the caliber of the Barbadian who went down. Every single Barbadian on that list came from either one of the established trades on the island. In other words, they were either carpenters or mason skill tradesmen or coppersmiths or teachers. Many of them were teachers. And it's pretty obvious why Barbadians would migrate to Brazil. They had a skill that Brazilians wanted or would pay for. They had the skill of being native English speakers. And so many of these people who migrated to Vitória, served as teachers of English. And once they acquired a knowledge of Portuguese, presumably they went on to teach in Brazilian schools. So that migration is an interesting aspect of the links between Barbados and Brazil. But now, let us go back to the very beginnings of settlement in Barbados. And so I take you from the late 19th, early 20th century, and we go back to the early 17th century. Barbados was settled as an English colony for tropical export agriculture. We know from our early history that tobacco was tried, but it could not compete after the initial 15 years of settlement. It couldn't compete with Virginian tobacco, and so was abandoned. Other crops were tried, such as indigo, which is a dye, produces a blue dye, used for staining cloth, ginger, tobacco, as I mentioned, but none of them provided the economic benefit that needed to sustain the colony of Barbados. And so some early Barbadian planters, having been made aware of sugarcane via Arawakan-speaking Amerindians from the northern part of South America, what would be today Venezuela and the Guyanas, who had played a meaningful role in the early settlement of Barbados, introduced the early settlers to sugarcane. And at that point in time in the world, in the Atlantic world, northeastern Brazil was a major producer of the major grower of sugarcane and a major producer of the byproducts of sugarcane, sugar, molasses, and the byproduct of aguardiente, what became rum. So Barbadian planters went to Brazil to be acquainted then with both the method and essential methods of setting up a plantation, being land, labor, and capital. Those three important points: land, labor, and capital. But a fourth one would be, of course, the technology and knowledge needed to process the sugarcane, which is a sweet grass that produces sucrose. So Barbadian planters made contacts in Brazil and brought sugarcane cuttings. You know, sugar grows from it's a grass, as I said, and it grows from the eye in the joint of the cane. So it would have been an easy matter to brought either cuttings in earth or cut cane and brought them back up to Barbados where they were planted. And then once they were planted and they grew, you then had a ready source of plants, so that the whole process of replanting after the first 2 or 3 ratoons, the recycling of the plant after it had been cut, and you allowed from the cut shoot a new sugarcane plant to grow. But after the 3rd year, the amount of sucrose goes down, so it becomes uneconomical to keep producing this. But another group, also very important in the early settlement of Barbados and the early economic growth of Barbados, who had located in Brazil, were the Sephardic Jews. Now, Judaism is divided into 2 main groups. You have the European group, Central European and adjacent countries, and these are the Ashkenazim. And you have the Mediterranean, including the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, and the Near East, countries like Iraq, Iran, etc. So, yes, here we are discussing this group, very important in the early settlement of Barbados, the Sephardic Jews. Now, 1492 was important in the Iberian Peninsula for a number of reasons. It was important because what's called the Reconquista, the quote-unquote reconquest of the Spanish part of the Iberian Peninsula, was achieved when the Moorish Caliphate, the Almoravid Caliphate, was defeated, and the last stronghold of Islam in Spain was conquered, Granada. And that happened in the year 1492. 1492 was also the year that the Catholic Majesties Isabella and Ferdinand employed the Genoese sailor Cristobal Columbus, to sail the ocean blue and engage in the voyages that resulted in something very important happening. Don't get carried away with Columbus. Forget about Columbus, the man, and focus on this one point. 1492 saw the destruction of what was a natural barrier to human and other biological interaction between the old world, Europe, Africa, Asia, and the New World, the Americas. So before 1492, these various continents were separated by the wall or the barrier of the Atlantic Ocean. 1492 changed the Atlantic from a barrier to a huge highway on which everything traveled backwards and forwards. Viruses, bacteria, cattle, horses. Before 1492, there were no horses in the Americas. There were no real beasts of burden as such. There was no cattle. There were no large dogs. I could go on and on and on. Plants. But on the other hand, in the old world, there were no turkeys. There were no ducks. So 1492 saw a global shift that would have happened whether Columbus lived or not. So, as I say, we shouldn't get too carried away with what Columbus did or did not do. It was the effect of European expansion across the Atlantic that caused this enormous shift in human demography, human biology, natural biology, medicine, disease, you name it. And among the shift of peoples, you see, were the Sephardic Jews who were expelled along with the Moors, the Moorish peoples of Sepharad, which is Spain, and subsequently Portugal. And they, on pain of remaining as Jews in Spain, where the Inquisition would burn them in an auto da fe, put them, do what was called very innocuously or a euphemism. They were relaxed. How were they relaxed? They were tied to a stake and burnt alive, and they were relaxed. That's the official Spanish terminology. Relajar los prisioneros, relax the prisoners. And many of them made their way then to Holland, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, because at that point in European history, the Dutch, which were part of the greater empire of Charles V, were revolting against Spanish control. And the Dutch had abandoned Catholicism and had become Dutch Calvinists, Dutch Lutherans, and so were prepared to accept Jews and provide them refuge. And then we fast forward in Dutch history to the early 17th century, when the Dutch decide to invade and seize the northern tip of northeastern Brazil. So the Dutch seize Recife. The Dutch seize Pernambuco, part of Pará, and established it as the colony of the Kingdom of the Low Countries in Netherlands. The Sephardic Jews who had relocated to Amsterdam and Rotterdam, seeing a new opportunity. The Sephardics were poor Jews. They weren't like the Ashkenazim. They were an urbane, well, in terms of culture and orientation, they were very urbane. They were cultivated. When they were in Spain, they were like the civil service of Spain, of the Spanish crown, playing very important roles. They were highly educated people. And they had links in all the ports of Europe. And then they decided to expand their Atlantic connections, and so they established themselves in Recife. And that lasted for some 20 odd years until the Portuguese colonial endeavor in Brazil, with the backing of the Roman Catholic Church, engaged in their own sort of mini reconquista, the reconquering of those parts of Brazil. And once again, the Sephardic Jews were faced with a dilemma: to abandon Judaism completely and adopt Christianity, to practice Judaism either publicly or in secret, where they ran the risk of being arrested and being taken before an ecclesiastical court and being sentenced to being burnt alive or any of the other horrific things that the Inquisition did, or to uproot themselves. At that point in time, in the very late 1640s, when the Dutch were being expelled from northeastern Brazil, England had undergone or was in the throes of a civil war. Charles I was beheaded. The Commonwealth of England, under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, who became the Lord Protector of England, took control of England. Now, from the 14th century, Jews had been expelled from England. A horrific thing happened in the town of York in northern England, when nearly 400 Jews were herded together in a tower, and wood was placed all around the tower. It was sealed, and men, women, and children were burnt alive, nearly 400 of them. And those that were left alive, were ordered to leave England. And it was against the law, English law, for Jews to return to England. So the Jews who fled northeastern Brazil appealed to Oliver Cromwell for permission to resettle in Barbados. And several of them did. I have here another book, interesting book. This is The Jewish Experience in Latin America. And in here, all these names, this is an alphabetical list of members of the Brazilian Jewish community recorded in the minute book of the congregations of Zur Israel and Magan and Abraham. And you go through them. And a number of these, if you want to see where they spent the rest of their lives and are buried, just go to the Nidhe Israel Synagogue in Bridgetown, walk through the graveyard, and you will see the names popping up over and over and over. From this list, let me pull out two names which are important: Dr. Abraham de Mercado and Rafael de Mercado. So, father and son, Abraham de Mercado and David Rafael de Mercado. Now, David Rafael in particular is quite important to the social and economic history of Barbados, because he brought with him skills from Brazil, including an intimate knowledge of the type of sugar mill or engine, sugar mill that ground and squeeze out the juice from the raw sugar cane, which could then be boiled repeatedly or it crystallized, and then from that you get your sugar and what leaks the molasses and ultimately rum. So David Rafael de Mercado invented a new type of sugar mill, which was technologically more efficient than the earlier windmills that had been built in Barbados, which processed more efficiently the grinding process of grinding the sugar cane, and hence produce more juice, more sugar, more rum, more molasses, and more money, which was the raison d'etre of the creation of Barbados as an agricultural colony of England. And based on sugar and its success with sugar, bittersweet history of sugar, because included in that is the sordid history of slavery, the slave trade, forced introduction of West Africans to the island, and the conditions under which they were forced to labor primarily in the sugar industry or elsewhere as well. But all of that is all related into one aspect of our social and economic history of the 17th century. Now, not only did Demercado introduce a new technology, but also what happened, and I get back to the whole issue of slavery. In all my research of the Sephardic Jews in the 17th and 18th centuries, I have never found any evidence that would support the view that Jews were major slave traders. But Jews did own slaves, despite the law that was passed in Barbados in the 1680s that said that a Jewish family could only have a limited number of slaves in the family, no more than 10. That meant that Jews really were prohibited from becoming plantation owners, because if you were going to operate a plantation, you had to have, remember I said plantations required 3 components: land, labor, and capital. And the labor, indentured servants were tried from England first, didn't work out. And then African slaves imported from West Africa were tried, and that worked well and created the whole plantation system of Barbados. So Jews did buy and sell slaves. There's no doubt about that. But the Jews engage in massive amounts of undertake voyages to West Africa, buy slaves there and bring them back to Barbados. I haven't found any evidence of that. The Nation of Islam has a well-known book which literally accuses Jews of being among the major slave traders of the Americas. As I said, I accept the fact that Jews did trade in slaves, but that were major slave traders. I personally have never found any evidence to support that, more or less from Barbados. Now, there were other members of the Jewish family here in of the Jewish community here in Barbados, which also played a role. One such individual is Abraham Rodriguez Brandon. He was one of the few Jews who actually owned the plantation. Brandon's, we all know Brandon's, just outside of Bridgetown, Brandon's Beach. Brandon's adjacent to the Griner Highway, the old Spring Garden Highway. Well, that was a Jewish property. Abraham Rodriguez Brandon owned down there, hence the name Brandon today. You go through the Barbados telephone directory today, and names pop out at you. Sephardic names: Abob, Lindo, Lobo, Masayo, Carvalho, Lopez, Pinheiro. All of these are Sephardic names that have survived down through the centuries. Now, the Sephardim as a community don't really exist in Barbados anymore. They either, in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, migrated from Barbados and established themselves in places like New York, Philadelphia, or London, or they intermarried with Barbadians. So in our DNA, a great many Barbadians do have DNA of the Sephardic. And so a great many of us do have that genetic DNA link that passes through Brazil, Amsterdam, Spain and Portugal, the Holy Land, Israel, going back thousands and thousands of years to Old Testament days. DNA is a remarkable technique for looking at one's ancestry and one's origins and geographical origins at different points in time and at different points in Earth geography. So the Sephardim, they severed links with Brazil, but then established links in the immediate area of the CARICOM and beyond. So Sephardic communities from Barbados went and established themselves in Nevis. Jamaica, remember that in 1655, the Venables expedition came to Barbados and took off 6,000 Barbadian men to serve as soldiers when Jamaica was being conquered from the Spanish by the English. And many of the Sephardic Jews of Barbados went up to Jamaica at that point in time. Then Curacao developed as a major Sephardic settlement, and so too did Suriname. And all you have to do is go to the archives and go through the wills of then Barbadian Sephardic Jews, and you see all these links coming up, where in the particular in the early period, the 17th and early 18th century, bequests are being made to a cousin in Paramaribo, Suriname, a brother in Curacao, a cousin up in Kingston, and then cousins elsewhere in New York, Charleston, South Carolina, London, or links back to Europe, Amsterdam, or Marseille in France, or Hamburg in Germany. And I said the Sephardic were an Atlantic peoples, a port peoples, a trading peoples, who had communication and financial networks, commercial networks all around the Atlantic world. Now, let us look at some of the other areas that I would like to touch on. Again, links with Brazil and Barbados. The most famous composer of Brazil is a man called Hector Villa-Lobos. And Villa-Lobos, as a young man, left northeastern Brazil, took passage on one of these steamships that linked Brazil to Europe via Barbados, and he stopped off in Barbados. And for perhaps a year or a bit more, he lived here, and he actually, musicologist, assert, actually did some of his composing here on the island. He lived in the Bridgetown Bay Street area, and to earn his living, he would play in many of the nightclubs that existed in Bay Street, Bridgetown, Nelson Street, etc. At that point in time, which is the first and part of the second decade of the 20th century, 1910s, 1920s. And one of his favorite or best-loved compositions, the Uzbekianos, you can listen to it, and from time to time, you hear passages which are reminiscent of Barbadian folk music, particularly like top band music that Villa-Lobos would have heard in Barbados and transposed into his composition, and he took back to Brazil with him. So that's one of the links that's perhaps not as well known as it might be. The person of Villa-Lobos linking Brazil and Barbados. Other links that we might not think of or recognize. If you go to the central bank and you look around both the gardens outside and the gardens inside, when Prime Minister Tom Adams decided that the central bank would be built on that location, the then governor of the central bank, Sir Courtney Blackman, engaged Brazil's and the world's probably premier landscape designer, Burle Marx, to come to Barbados to create and supervise the landscaping, both internally and externally, of the central bank of Barbados. So that's like an unrecognized but a major contribution to the evolving landscape of Bridgetown. We like Bajan cherry juice, and we buy Bajan cherry juice from the Pinewood Dairy. But is it Bajan cherry juice grown on Bajan cherry trees in Barbados and squeezed and processed in Barbados? And honestly, the answer is no. If not all of it, the vast majority of Bajan cherry juice is imported from Brazil, where you have the land space to plant hundreds of acres in Barbados cherry trees and process the cherries, squeeze them, and export the juice. So that's another link, perhaps an unrecognized link between Brazil and Barbados. But there are other things. I mean, imports from Brazil and a wide range of products have increased in recent years or in recent decades. Imports of finished products, foodstuffs, timber, lumber. Brazil produces a huge gamut of industrial, commercial, finished products, high-end products, and utilitarian everyday products. If you go to Quartz and you see the Tramontina range of pots and pans, household kitchenware, these are all made in Brazil and exported to Barbados. And so these are just one of the many examples of the type of imports that Barbados engages in from Brazil. Now, in a previous career of mine, I was a diplomat for the Barbados government. And I served as acting ambassador, chargé d'affaires, to the countries of Venezuela and Brazil. And one of my duties was to promote tourism and, of course, to promote commercial exchanges. Now, Barbados, if you look at our foreign exchange figures, Barbados imports far more from Brazil than we export to Brazil. We may export, I think we export a little bit of our high-end rum because our rum is so good. But there are obvious limits to what Barbados can export to Brazil. But we are a tourist country. We rely heavily on tourism. Tourism is at the present moment in the short and medium run. It is a major engine of economic growth and stability and sustainability in Barbados. And so one of my aims and objectives was to increase tourism inflows from Brazil to Barbados. And after I left the Foreign Service and went into teaching at the University of West Indies, of course, we retained our embassies to Venezuela and Brazil, and subsequently they were direct, because one of the problems that we faced was air links. If there are not effective air links between country A and country B, if you can't move people from country A to country B, then your efforts at promoting tourism are going to go to waste, because if you can't effectively move people from the point of origin to the point of reception, then, as the Jamaicans say, you're spinning top in mud. You're essentially wasting your money and energies. So we did have direct services via the Brazilian airline, not Varig, but Goiás, I think, was the airline that operated between Brazil and Barbados. That, unfortunately, for a number of reasons, has come to an end. Perhaps sometime in the future, we can resurrect these air links and resume that tourism flow. We do get some Brazilian tourists, and I mean, it's difficult then for them. They will obviously have to fly up to Panama and use Copa to come down to Barbados, or go up to Miami and come down from Miami to Barbados, which increases the cost of vacation in Barbados. But in the early 20th century, there were quite meaningful visits by Barbadians. Sorry, there were quite meaningful visits by Brazilians from Brazil to Barbados. I had alluded to the rubber boom and the development of Manaus. The rubber boom created many millionaires in that part of Brazil who opted to take long holidays in Europe. But it would always break their holidays in Barbados and spend 2 or 3 weeks there. And you see it in hotels. Again, I go back to my handbook of Barbados and look here. When you bring people from one country to another, there can be adventuresome, and it can try so that, well, visitors to Barbados will try our cocoa and flying fish, or breadfruit cocoa and mackerel, or whatever you're going to serve them. But sometimes, to be reassured, they like something a bit familiar from home. Smokers, when you're a smoker, I'm not a smoker. I did have a brother who was a heavy smoker. Smokers want to have a favorite brand of cigarette. They don't want to smoke anything else but that brand. So if you look here, the Costa and Company. And what are they advertising? Brazilian cigarettes. You see? So Brazilians coming to Barbados at the beginning of the 20th century could be assured, if they were heavy smokers, that they would have access to Brazilian cigarettes here in Barbados. That's just like one example of an early link between Brazil and Barbados. A few hotels were set up here that had the majority of their business from Brazilian visitors. There was a hotel on the West Coast, and then the St. Lawrence Hotel, and many Brazilians also went to the Marine Hotel, which is where the Palmarine Hotel School is now. But when I was a child, that was a huge hotel, biggest hotel on the island, and there was a hotel that dates from the 19th century. And yes, in the early 20th century, a large number of its clientele, well-off Brazilians who holidayed in Barbados for long periods of time. There were high-end consumers, people with money, spending money, contributing to the economic growth of Barbados. So you see, in retrospect, and trying to pull everything together very quickly, a little repetition goes a long way in my teaching experience. Brazil provided Barbados with the technology and the raw materials to create the sugar industry that created a landscape of Barbados, created a culture in Barbados, created a new demographic pattern in Barbados, created a country that, and I quote Whistler, who in 1655, a famous quote of his, Barbados is the richest spot of ground in the world. What made Barbados the richest spot of ground in the world? Sugar, the growth of sugar, the labor of Africans to grow and process that sugar, and the byproducts, sugar, rum, molasses, all valuable. And so in the 17th century, Barbados then was like the Dubai of today, or the Singapore of today. It was, as Whistler said, the richest spot of ground in the world. So Brazil played a major role in that transition from a tobacco, non-performing economy, a sugarcane, sugar-based economy, which was high-performing and high-end and produced great wealth for Barbados. And then, of course, you move, as I pointed out, the group of Sephardic Jews, very important in that transition and the agricultural development of Barbados. And then you fast forward to the 19th century, the late 19th century, the movement of Barbadians down. I didn't mention specifically. There was a famous railroad constructed. There's a book I have called Ferrovia do Diablo, The Devil's Railroad. And that documents the building of the Recife Marmore Railroad, went from the coast of Brazil into the interior of Brazil. And there was a railroad that traversed thick rainforests, swampland, hills. Any natural obstacle in the way had to be demolished in order for the railroad tracks to run through it. The best railroad builders at the time were either the British, or the Americans. And they needed engineers. And a lot of engineers who had been important in the building of the Panama Canal and who used as their primary source of labor Barbadians, because Barbadians were educated, Barbadians were literate, and if you're going to have people handling key aspects of demolition, building, using explosives, monitoring goods, monitoring store houses, etc., you need literate people. So the Americans took a little over 40,000 Barbadians to Panama with them. When the canal was built, new opportunities opened up in South America, including Brazil. And so American engineers took Barbadians who had worked with them in Panama to work with them again in Brazil. Now, here's an offshoot of that. And this is perhaps an unsavory aspect of our links with Brazil. There was a famous Irishman, a man called Sir Roger Casement, who actually came to Barbados on a number of occasions and who was hanged by the English. He was an Irishman. He was hanged by the English for being an Irish patriot. But Casement was somewhat of an adventurer, and he was used by Brazilian ranchers to expedite their movement into Amazonia and their movement to oust the Native American groups in Amazonia, groups like the Yanomamo, for example. So Casement actually had an army of Barbadian men who would go into the interior and confront the Indians and forcibly shift them off the line. And there were many fatalities, mortalities in these confrontations because it was rifles against bow and arrows. So that is not a very savory aspect or an aspect of our links or historical links with Brazil, but history has the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we can't sweep the ugly under the carpet. We have to shine the torchlight on it, expose it, discuss it, reveal it, bring it into the discourse. So, as I said, that's but one example of perhaps things that are unsavory. The Great Train Row, Biggs is another example, perhaps, of Barbados being used as a transit point. Now, another link that perhaps I'd bring to your attention you may not be aware of, I've discussed shipping and the fact that all the major Atlantic steamship lines pass through Barbados. As I said, Barbados was the hub of the Caribbean and the major transit point of the entire Atlantic. So we look then at, as I said, some of these links. To conclude in this discourse on links and impact and relationships between Barbados and Brazil, let's shift and let's look at a botanical area that perhaps we'd look at a major botanical link, sugarcane, but there are other ongoing links, botanical links, between Brazil and Barbados that continue up to today. There's been a resurgence in Barbados of late of individuals who actually formed Facebook groups and other groups, and lots of plants are being tried to see whether they'll grow in Barbados and how successful it will be, both ornamental and fruit producing, etc. And you know, one of the major sources for this range of experimentation with plants that's on the way now, no other country but Brazil. So there you have it, a wide range of areas that have impacted our island and which continue to be celebrated and enjoyed in the Barbados of the 21st century. So thanks very much for having listened to me, and I hope you've learned something from this. Have a good day.
Thank you very much, Karl.
Okay, so as you see, this was the conversation or the talk of Karl Watson that we recorded yesterday morning. Unfortunately, we cannot ask him any questions right now, but does someone have any comments? You want to comment on his talk, or if you have a question, we can try to answer it. Let's see. No comments? No questions? Okay. So I hope you enjoyed the session. That's it for today. And last week we will have our last session. And we expect to talk about Brazilian architecture. So let's hope that will be possible. It is scheduled, so I will let you know in the chat. And I say bye-bye. See you next week. Ciao.
Good night, Marcos. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Welcome.